Alright guys, we are here with one of my favorite authors, Mr. Gary Taubes. He's the author of Good Calories, Bad Calories, as well as his newest book, Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It. Gary, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Sean.
I read your first book. It's a big fat book. There's a lot of information. I probably read it like 3 times. Now, you spent a lot of time on that book, right? What was it, 5, 6 years?
5 years of my life.
You've been a science writer. What got you into the nutrition field?
Well, you know, I was writing about controversial science. I was writing about good science and bad science, mostly about bad science, people who discover non-existent phenomena and then usually live to regret it. And I wrote a book on cold fusion, which was this sort of great fiasco of the late 1980s. And some of my friends in the physics community said, if you think the science in cold fusion was bad, which it was, you should look into some of this stuff in public health. It's terrible. Yeah. So I did. I started in the early 90s and a variety of subjects that depended on the science of epidemiology, which is you know, the science that links sort of lifestyle factors to disease, and that was pretty clearly a pseudoscience. And yeah, one thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was looking at the science behind whether salt caused high blood pressure, and then whether fat caused heart disease, and then what the hell caused the obesity epidemic. Right. And so yeah, it's been almost 20 years now. And I may never get out of this field. My main goal with this show is to crush this whole like eat less, exercise more dogma. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the law of thermodynamics, because everybody throws that out. The law of thermodynamics, you know, taking more than you burn, then you're going to gain weight. Now there's truth to that, but what's the problem with that? Well, the problem is pretty simple, and it's pretty funny how people just don't get this. The laws of thermodynamics always apply, okay? It's like a law of the universe. You know, not that it's helped me much, but I studied physics at Harvard, so I'm pretty familiar with the laws of physics, and they always hold. They tell us about how the universe works.
Right, gotcha.
But there's no causation. No causation. They say nothing about why something happens. They only say what happens if it does happen. So with the law of thermodynamics, it says if something gets bigger, if its mass increases, it has to take in more energy than it expends. That's the first law of thermodynamics. Basically, it's energy conservation. You can't create energy from nothing. Right. So if one of us gets fatter, we have to take in more calories than we expend. That's all it says. And a corollary, you know, one way of looking at it, there's a lot of metaphors I use in the book. One I do use, one I wish I used because a blogger told me about it recently. The one I use is, imagine that a room gets crowded. So a restaurant in San Diego or, you know, San Francisco, and it's really crowded and it's full of energy. And like when fat tissue when we're too fat, we have all this energy stored in our fat tissue. Now we have all this energy stored in a restaurant, and the energy is in the form of people, and you want to know why it got crowded. Right. So you say to me, Gary, why did this restaurant get crowded? And I say, well, because more people came in than left. True. And you're going to go, true, like, so what? Obviously, big deal. Are you dicking with me? And I'm going to go, no, listen, if more people enter than leave, it's got to get crowded, right? And it's still true. Has to be true. I've told you absolutely nothing meaningful about why this restaurant has gotten crowded. It's the same thing. When you say somebody got fat, if they take in more energy than they expend, they have to get fat. True. Actually, they don't. They could put on muscle. They could grow in a lot of different ways. But let's assume we're just talking about the fat tissue. You've said nothing about why they take in more energy than they expend and why they get fat, why their fat tissue expands. You know, the other metaphor that I got online from a blogger was, you know, you could talk about why somebody's rich, one person's rich, and another person's poor. And so I say, okay, you know, why is Warren Buffett so rich? And you say to me, well, because he made more money than he spent. And it's, again, the exact same logic, and you've told me absolutely nothing. The whole laws of thermodynamics say nothing about why someone gets fat.
Okay, so why does someone overeat?
So that's the thing. If they get bigger, they have to overeat. They have to take. That's what, when we define overeating, we mean they take in more calories than they expend. One of the things I do in the book is I talk about how European researchers perceived obesity prior to the Second World War. And one of the metaphors they used for this was growing children. So a growing child He's in positive energy balance. He's overeating. He's taking in more calories than he expends. He's got to be, because he's getting bigger. He's building bone and muscle tissue and connective tissue and fat, and his organs are getting bigger, and all these things need energy to get bigger. You can't just create energy from nothing. So he's got to take in more. So he eats voraciously, sits or might sit around the house all day long.
Right.
But he doesn't overeat because he's growing. Excuse me, he doesn't grow because he overeats. He overeats because he's growing.
So,
And he's growing because of growth hormone. And the argument I make in this book is, you know, just like everything else in the human body, fat tissue is regulated very carefully. You know, when we grow, when we get obese, when our fat tissue expands to the point we have all these chronic metabolic disturbances that go with it, it's very damaging to the rest of the body. Our bodies don't want to be obese. So they regulate the fat tissue, and it's regulated by hormones and enzymes. And again, the argument that these pre-World War II Europeans use is, you know, you can begin to figure out just from like men and women fatten differently. That tells you that sex hormones are involved in the regulation of fat accumulation. Not just how much fat they put on, but where they put on fat. Men put it on in the gut, women put it on below the waist. You know, as we age, we fatten differently. There are all kinds of what are called lipodystrophies, which are disorders of fat accumulation. By studying all of these, you can begin to narrow down how and why people get fat. And you know, the hormone that fundamentally regulates fat accumulation is insulin. And, you know, it's funny, this isn't a controversy. It's never been a controversy. It was discovered in the 1960s that insulin regulates fat accumulation. And even when you talk, you know, I was just going through my notes in preparation of writing another article, so I was looking at my notes from Good Calories, Bad Calories. And I had been talking to this woman who's actually Terry Meritos Flyer. She's the wife of the dean of Harvard Medical School. Both of them are obesity researchers. And Terry said to me, I didn't even notice this, or I would have quoted in the book, there's nothing like insulin for laying down new fat.
Right.
You know, I was interviewing this guy, Ron Arky, who's another Harvard professor, former president of the American Diabetes Association, and Ron said to me, you know, insulin is better than anything at creating fat. That's what it does. So the fundamental argument is, I mean, what the science tells you, which everyone ignores, is insulin makes you fat. If you want to get fat out of the fat tissue, you have to lower your insulin levels. If you start accumulating fat, and I've had these conversations with, you know, experts when I talk about it, because a lot of the experts are firmly, and most of them firmly believe it's all about overeating. So I say, let's say we had a drug that increases fat accumulation. So I give you this drug and you start getting fatter. The same way I could have a child whose growth is stunted, I could give him growth hormone, he'll start growing more. If that happens, you'll have to take in more calories than you expend. You'll have to overeat. The cause will be the drug. And they'll go, yeah, yeah, that's true, that's true. And I'll say, well, we have that drug. It's called insulin. You know, and we've known it. You give type 2 diabetics insulin, they get fatter.
Right.
Even if they don't increase the amount of food they eat. They'll get fatter. They've got to be in positive energy balance if they don't eat more. You know, one thing we do when we start getting fatter is we go on diets. So now they have to expend less energy. This is what the laws of thermodynamics tell you. They always have to take in more calories than they expend if they're getting bigger. But if they cap the amount of calories they're willing to take in, they're going to have to expend less energy.
Right. So in the book, when you were talking about the law of thermodynamics, you had calories in, calories out. Now we act like the two of those have nothing to do with each other. You can just hold one steady, you know, hold your calories in and just expend as many calories as you want to, and it won't affect the calories in. Can you talk about those? And those?
Well, that's the fundamental idea. Whenever you tell someone, okay, the way to lose weight is to eat less and exercise more, what you're actually telling them, again, it's the same idea that we've got these variables, energy in minus energy out. So if we could increase energy in, or excuse me, increase energy out. So I'm going to tell you to go to the gym, burn 500 calories that you wouldn't have burned, and if you don't eat any more than you did the day before, in theory you're going to lose weight, right? Okay? So it makes perfect sense, except it assumes that the amount of food you take in and the amount of food you expend have nothing in common. That they're what mathematicians would call independent variables. So you can manipulate one. I could change energy out any way I want, and it's going to have no effect on energy in. And intuitively we know that's nonsense, because there used to be this concept called working up an appetite. And the idea was you'd go to the gym, or you'd go play 2 sets of tennis, or you'd play some, 18 holes of golf, or you'd go for a hike and you'd work up an appetite. You'd come back and you'd be hungry. And one way, again, another idea that I got from a blogger in England, he had this thing where he said, imagine that I'm making this 8-course meal, and it's a feast, and I've got the best chefs from like Top Chef, coming to my house, and they're going to create this 8-course feast, and I want you to come, you're invited, and I want you to bring your appetite, because there's going to be a ton of food, and I want you to be able to eat it all. And then what would you do to assure that you came hungry?
I would expend some energy that day so I could work up an appetite.
Yeah, you'd go to the gym, you'd work out, you'd probably skip lunch or something, because you'd think that, okay, I'm going to be pigging out at dinner, I want to be hungry. You might walk to my house instead of drive. All these things, basically what you do to get hungry are exactly the things we tell people to do to lose weight, which is eat less and exercise more.
It's so backwards.
It's so backwards. So it's sort of the idea is, and you could show this in animals, and there was an article in Scientific American again by this couple, Terry Meritos Flyer and Jeff Flyer. This is back in 2007. It was called What Fuels Fat? And they just pointed out, when a rat is, a rodent, an animal is starved in a lab, if you restrict its calories, so you reduce energy in, not only does the animal get hungry, which is obvious, but the amount of energy it expends actually goes down. So it loses the impulse to physical activity, it doesn't want to move. And in laboratory experiments, these rats will actually just sit there all day long. They'll only move to get food. Its body temperature drops. Its metabolism slows down. It's expending less energy because it has less energy to expend. And if you increase expenditure, you get the same effect. The animal either gets hungry or it expends less energy the rest of the day. What the animal's trying to do is make sure that it always burns the energy that comes in, and that it's always got enough energy coming in to feed its expenditure. So it's trying to remain in energy balance. And you manipulate any one of these variables and the other one will change.
It's going to try to compensate.
We'll try to compensate.
Well, that brings us to exercise. I work out. I'm sure you work out. A lot of people work out there and there's benefit to it. But in terms of weight loss, what does the research show on that?
It's never shown that you can lose weight merely by increasing your expenditure. You look at the meta-analyses, these systematic reviews where the researchers go through all the data, and they can't show an effect. And the knee-jerk response from the exercise aficionados is, well, surely they just did the experiment wrong. They didn't work out hard enough. They didn't work out long enough. The sort of conventional wisdom on exercise now is you have to work out at least an hour a day just to maintain your weight loss. And the reason that's a conventional wisdom is because nobody's been able to show that any less than an hour a day helps. And when my favorite study on this was done by Danish researchers in the late 80s. And they actually took couch potatoes and trained them to be marathon runners. So over the course of 18 months, they went from not exercising at all to running a marathon at the end of the study. Now, I've been a jock my whole life. When I was younger, before my knee gave in to arthritis from the old football injuries, and I used to run all the time. I could never get past 8 miles because I weighed like 220 pounds. My body just couldn't do it. These people actually got to the point where they ran marathons, and the men lost 5 pounds of body fat, in 18 months, and the women had 0% change in body composition.
Wow.
0. And the joke is, even the researchers back then said maybe because they increased their carbohydrate content to compensate for what they were doing in running. And nobody, again, whenever I read blogs or somebody reviews my book and you read the criticisms, and people will say, the one I was reading today, if you go out and run 5 miles a day, do this as an experiment, you run 5 miles a day, you will lose weight because that's what the laws of thermodynamics dictate. And that's not what they dictate. And the world is full of people who run 5 miles a day and continue to get fatter year in and year out.
Yeah, I worked in the gym for 8 years, and we had the treadmill gang. Always on the treadmill, and very seldom did I see anybody's bodies change. And even when they did change, and let's say life circumstances happened and they didn't come to the gym for a few weeks, they always came back bigger than they were in the beginning.
Well, this is one of the interviews I did for this. I wrote a piece for New York Magazine about this after Good Calories, Bad Calories came out, and I interviewed a guy at Stanford who's an exercise physiologist who's been studying the role of exercise in weight since the 1970s, and he told me, you know, he was just talking about himself. He said, you know, I'm 5'7", I weigh 135 pounds, I'm a devoted runner, I've run 18 different marathons. He said, my weight has been within a pound of 135 pounds, whether I'm running and my training for a marathon, or whether I've got, you know, plantar fasciitis and are laid out and don't get to run for a year. And I said, do you realize what you just told me? Your weight stays 135 pounds independent of how much you exercise. And he literally said to me, you know, I never thought of that. This is a response you get a lot in these fields. The first time he had a colleague, and when I suggested that the reason exercise doesn't lead to weight loss was because people work up an appetite, she said to me, she'd worked on this for 10 years and was mystified by it. And she said to me, you know, I never really thought of that. And then I interviewed this guy at the University of South Carolina who's, again, one of the grand old men of the field, and had co-authored guidelines, physical activity guidelines, published by the American College of Sports Medicine, and I forget if it was the AMA or the AHA. But he said, he was fascinating because he described himself as short, fat, and bald when he started running 35 years ago. And here was 35 years later. He had, by his estimate, run 80,000 miles, which is the equivalent of more than 3 times around the Earth at the equator. And now he said he was short, fatter, and balder. He had gained like 30-odd pounds. And I said to him, do you actually believe that had you gotten to run more, you wouldn't have put on that weight? And he said, well, you know, I never really thought about it because I don't see how I could have fit more running into my life. Right. But yes, maybe if I could.
That's a lot of time spent running, you know, just to keep your weight in check. Wow.
And it didn't do it.
Huh.
And, you know, the way I use this anecdote in the book, and I said, this man is trapped in a paradigm. We're all trapped in this calories in, calories out paradigm, and it's the wrong way to think about it. Calories are very valuable, you know, for measuring how much food you take in and how many nutrients of each nutrient you take in. But they're not the relevant variable to why we get fat. And what's amusing is even the first guy who proved that a calorie is a calorie was a German nutritionist named Max Rubner, who did this in the 1880s, 1890s. And Rubner was a very famous figure in the history of nutrition. And I was reading his book. There was the Army did a translation of his classic text in the early 60s. And, you know, 120-odd years ago, he said, yes, a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. A calorie of protein is equal to, takes just as much energy into the body as a calorie of fat, as a calorie of carbohydrates. But when you're talking about obesity, that's not what's relevant. What you want to know is the effect of the different nutrients on the ductless glands. And the ductless glands was what they called hormones in the 1890s, hormone glands. That's what you want to know.
So staying on the topic of exercise for a second, my audience out there is going to be like, well, you guys are going to exercise on the show. Why are we doing exercise segments? You work out. Why do you work out?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not, nowhere am I saying that exercise isn't good for you.
Right.
Although, it's, a lot of the exercise we do definitely gives our joints a pounding. I mean, you know, one of my throwaway lines is it definitely makes orthopedic surgeons rich, the way we exercise. And I'm not sure that's a good thing. I recently did a story for the magazine Discover, where I talked to researchers studying longevity, and I asked them all what they did, and time after time after time they said, well, I'll tell you what I don't do. I don't pound my joints into dust running. I think exercise is good for you for a lot of different reasons. Cardiovascular health, you know, makes you feel better, makes you sleep better, it makes you look better. I'm healthier when I feel better when I exercise. I don't think it does a damn thing for weight. But I think there are a lot of reasons to exercise, and there's some good evidence showing that it can improve pre-diabetic conditions, that it can improve heart disease risk factors, it elevates HDL, it lowers triglycerides, it makes you a little more insulin sensitive. All these tend to be short-term effects. Most of us exercise because we want to lose weight. I mean, some of us exercise because we're vain, and that's fine. You know, makes you feel better. It's kept me going for like 30 years to the gym. Actually, you know, my favorite, I read these blogs and stuff, and one weight trainer on TV going, you know, we won't find Gary, I didn't like my books, you won't find Gary Taubes taking his shirt off in front of an auditorium, and it's like, well, no, you won't, but, oh, man, can't we keep this to science? The, point is, it's not about energy expenditure, and I have friends who, in the, you know, strength training friends who thinks resistance training can make a big difference in changing what's known as fuel partitioning, which is something we're going to talk about shortly. So it can have an effect on weight loss, potentially, although I don't find the evidence compelling enough to suggest it in my book, but I'm not sure they're not right. So, but yeah, those are good. There are a lot of good reasons to exercise, but if you think it alone will lead to weight loss without changing your diet.
Yeah.
So let's say I'm drinking 2 beers a night, and I'm having my Coca-Colas, and I'm eating, you know, all my white bread and potatoes, and I'm just going to go to the gym and exercise, and it's, you know, I'm going to lose weight. I doubt it.
There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people out there who say, "Oh, don't change anything about your diet. Just burn an extra 500 calories a day, and do that 7 days in a row, and you're going to lose a pound of fat."
You're not.
It's not quite that simple.
It's not that simple at all.
And exercise is a very good thing. But if your main goal, you're going to the gym because you want to lose fat, you know, not sure how effective that's going to be. So the big question that everybody out there wants to know. Why do we get fat?
Well, we get fat.
It's the name of your book.
The name of my book. Why we get fat? I've talked about, you know, obesity being disorder. It's not a disorder of energy balance, of eating too much, exercising too little. It's a disorder of fat accumulation. Our fat is regulated incorrectly, and certain foods change the regulation of our fat tissue, and they happen to be the foods we've been told to eat for the past 30 or 40 years. And one of the most interesting parts of my research is, until the 1960s, the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates make you fat. Pasta, rice, potatoes, beer, sweets, anything made with sugar, fattening. That's fattening, other foods aren't. 1960s, we start to believe that dietary fat causes heart disease, and suddenly we're all being told by the late 1970s, early 1980s, that a heart-healthy diet that makes you lose weight is a diet that's rich in those very same carbohydrates that my mother's generation, your grandmothers, believed was fattening. And not only are we being told to, you know, we're the U.S. Food Guide pyramid, the base of the pyramid was, you know, rice, potatoes, pasta, bread, all these foods. So, like the baked potato in my mother's generation was fattening, and by the 1980s, it's a diet food.
It's heart healthy.
It's heart healthy. It's not dense calories. It's so. The other thing that happened is, beginning around 1959, people start figuring out what regulates fat accumulation, and there's that hormone insulin. So by 1965, it's clear that insulin regulates fat formation. What you have to do to get fat out of your fat tissue and burn it is lower insulin levels. The way you lower insulin levels is get rid of the carbs in the diet. The way you raise insulin levels is add carbs to your diet. And now we're being told to eat more and more carbs and less fat, which happens to be the one nutrient that doesn't stimulate insulin secretion. Sugar consumption starts to explode, in part because sugar is fat-free. I actually have an American Heart Association pamphlet from the 1996 that says, in order to lower the fat content to your diet, you know, trade in snacks with fat and saturated fat for pretzels and, you know, corn chips and sugar, and I mean, literally, eat sugar instead of saturated fat.
Fat phobia.
And there was this theory that grew out of this, that you couldn't get fat if you didn't eat foods with fat in it. It was, again, one of these thermodynamic arguments that was basically meaningless or irrelevant to the human body. But that was a theory. So at the beginning of the 80s, we all thought, you know, you could eat. It doesn't matter how much sugar it has. If it doesn't have fat, you're not going to get fat. And all of this coincides with the obesity epidemic. Doesn't mean it caused it. but it's a pretty compelling argument that it did.
So we're looking at the mechanism inside of the body. Insulin stores fat and keeps you from burning fat. And the very foods that we've been told to consume are the foods that are going to increase our insulin. Now, is it all carbohydrates? Because, you know, there's people out there are going to go, well, what about vegetables? What about fruit? We're talking about refined carbohydrates? Or what are we talking about?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, I use carbohydrates have come to mean both the molecules themselves, the glucose, the fructose, the galactose, and the carbohydrate containing foods. And no, the answer is some foods are more fattening than others. The easier they are to digest, the easiest way to digest carbs is by putting them in, you know, liquids, so beer or soda or fruit juice, milk. The other way to do it is to refine it into flour, because you can't, you know, we don't eat wheat until we refine it into flour, basically, and the more refined it is, the easier it is to digest, the more it raises your blood sugar, the more that insulin goes up. So certain foods, like, so when I said foods are fattening, my mother's generation believed they're fattening, I didn't include broccoli and kale and spinach, the green leafy vegetables, the salad vegetables, because they have very low carbohydrate content, and the carbohydrate in there is bound up with fiber, which slows down the digestion. So there are fattening foods, and this is what's so strange is everybody talks about this like it's quackery. But literally, all I'm saying is there are fattening foods and foods that aren't fattening. Unfortunately, the foods that aren't fattening are animal products for the most part that are completely non-fattening. So you could eat as much of those as you want because they will not generate the hormonal response necessary to make you accumulate fat in your fat tissue, which everyone takes to being a license for gluttony.
It's not.
But it's not. It's just saying you won't be that hungry. You'll eat as much as you want, you'll stop, and later you'll eat more, and you'll stop, and you won't get fat, so nobody will care.
Challenge to the audience. Have bacon and eggs for breakfast instead of cereal, and just see how much more full you are with bacon and eggs. It's amazing. So it's really hard to overconsume calories.
Well, it's not only that, because, you know, you can do it. Like, I can go to a steak restaurant.
Very challenging.
And eat, you know, I could eat, I bet you I could eat 5,000 calories of steak at a sitting effortlessly.
Are you serious?
Yeah, actually, there's this famous restaurant in El Paso, Texas that serves a 72-ounce steak. And if you eat it in an hour, it's free. And okay, I would probably die doing this, but I've always thought I could do that. The problem is they also serve baked potatoes and rice and potatoes, and you've got to eat all the fixings with it. But the 72-ounce steak in an hour, effortlessly. You can actually, but you're not overeating, technically, because you're not getting fatter when you do it. Your body will adjust, it'll burn more energy, expend more energy over the next few days because it has more energy to expend. Your appetite, it's not so much because it's fulfilling, it's because of the way your body makes the nutrients available to your cells. So when you eat the carbs, the insulin spikes and it stores everything and it locks it up in the fat tissue. So a couple of hours later, when you start running, you've burned through the blood sugar peak, and blood sugar is coming down, the insulin is still keeping the fatty acids locked in the fat tissue. So in effect, you start to get hungry, and you eat again. If you don't eat the carbs, but you eat the same amount, let's say you eat, you know, then insulin levels don't go up, you store some of the fat in the fat tissue, but then it comes right out again when you need it, and you burn it. So it's like your body works the way it's supposed to work. You know, you start burning the calories you're consuming immediately, and some of it gets stored for later, and then as you know, blood sugar levels come down, the fat comes out of the fat tissue, and you just start burning your fatty acids, and that's how your body's supposed to work. As opposed to this thing where you eat the carbs, your insulin level spikes, you lock it, you know, it takes longer to come down, and until it gets below a certain point, the fat isn't going to be oxidized. So you start to get hungry because your blood sugar gets lower, and your body wants to restock because it doesn't realize that the fat is there to be burned. So, you know, your body in effect works the way it's supposed to work. And, you know, if you just look at animals don't get chronically obese. I mean, there are animals that get fat because they're hibernating, and they get fat because they're migrating, and there are animals, you know, herbivores almost invariably that live on, you know, carbohydrate-rich foods that put on a lot of fat, like hippopotami for thermal, you know, either protection from carnivores or thermal, you know, insulation if they're living in water. They don't get chronically obese because chronic obesity is a detriment to survival. So you get rid of these carbs, You could eat, you know, you'll have binges. I actually, when I was doing the book, I interviewed this woman who's an anthropologist in Australia, and she was telling me about an experiment she did. Actually, Michael Pollan talks about the same experiment in his book, In Defense of Food, but he didn't actually interview her. So she takes these Aborigines from the urban areas in Australia and she brings them back to the bush to eat their native diet. And she says, you know, it's impossible to overeat on your native diet. You know, you're hunting kangaroo and stuff like that. And I said, but wait a minute, 20 minutes ago we were talking about you watch these Aborigines kill a kangaroo and each eat 6 pounds of meat in one night.
Whoa. Whoa.
You know, a lot of meat. Actually, there's your 72-ounce steak, give or take. Almost, actually it's more. You know, and so it's not overeating because they didn't get fat. And they didn't get fat because there weren't carbs that drove the insulin that drove fat accumulation. So that's the thing. We've been eating since the mid-1970s. The conventional wisdom has been high carb, low fat diets, heart healthy. Unfortunately, they make you fat.
It's making us obese and it's making us diabetic, which is associated with heart disease. So that brings us to our last question. When people hear this, reduce the carbohydrates, increase the protein, increase the fat, they think heart disease. Now, we've got markers for heart disease, triglycerides, low HDL. Can you tell us about how these are actually caused by carbohydrates, not really fat?
Well, this is what got me into this business to begin with. I was doing the story for the New York Times Magazine on what caused the obesity epidemic. And I come upon these 5 studies of the Atkins diet, comparing the Atkins, which is high fat, high saturated fat, eat as much as you want, to a low fat, low calorie American Heart Association heart healthy diet. And by low calorie, I mean, you know, semi-starvation, eat 1,500 calories, 1,600 calories a day. So you're eating, you know, lettuce and skinless chicken breasts for lunch and thinking about food all the time. So, and these studies are done, and everyone, not only did the Atkins diet lead to more weight loss in every single one of them, but they had better heart disease risk factors. So their HDL was higher, their triglycerides were lower. When people, since that time, that was 2002, since then, you know, about a dozen more studies have been done. You know, insulin's lower, glucose tolerance is better, insulin sensitivity is better, uric acid levels are lower, and you know, when you look again into the underlying science, what you learn is that, you know, carbohydrates bring down HDL. This was actually known since the late 1960s. And HDL is the single best predictor of heart disease. And when you read these articles, you know, I was reading an article in the New England Journal of Medicine where they were talking about carbohydrates as a biomarker, HDL as a biomarker of carbohydrate consumption. So what that means is the lower your HDL, the more we can assume you're eating carbohydrates. And there is no single variable that predicts heart disease better than HDL. When HDL is low, you're at high risk of heart disease. So that means when you eat a lot of carbs, you're at high risk of heart disease. The other fundamental argument here is obesity is associated with a high risk of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, arthritis, gout, you name it. Virtually every chronic disease we suffer from, you're more likely to get it if you're overweight or obese, or certainly obese. So you could make the argument that whatever makes you fat causes heart disease, causes diabetes. And one reason this idea came about that carbohydrates were diet foods was because they were blaming fat on heart disease on fat, so they're telling people to eat more carbs. It's got to lower the fat, you're going to raise the carbs to compensate. So heart disease is associated with obesity. If you're fat, you're more likely to have obesity. So the logic sort of dictated that if fat causes heart disease, it also has to cause obesity. And if carbs prevent heart disease, they also have to prevent obesity. Because the assumption is whatever makes you fat also gives you heart disease and diabetes and cancer. And it's almost assuredly the case that it's the carbohydrates that make you fat. Particularly the sugars could be the worst. So, and then when you go through the literature, which I did, and talk to the experts, one of the advantages I have as a journalist, I can just call these people up You know, I'll do a story, I'll call my editors at Science and I'll say I want to do a story on mechanisms of insulin resistance, which is sort of the fundamental defect here. Then I could talk to everyone in the field. Mm-hmm. I want to do a story on Alzheimer's disease, I could talk to the leading experts in the field. There's mechanisms by which insulin can cause cancer, by which insulin can cause, at least, you know, cause or exacerbate Alzheimer's disease. And not, you know, I'm not saying insulin is a bad hormone. Insulin is a fundamental hormone that we can't live without, but when it gets elevated unnaturally in a way that we would never design it was to deal with, it has all these negative reactions throughout the body that can explain virtually every one of these chronic diseases. Doesn't mean it does. Okay, maybe that science is wrong, I don't know. But when you look at this sort of picture over 150 years, like cancer used to be a very rare disease, particularly in populations that didn't eat Western diets. And as late as the 1960s, Canadian researchers went to the records for hospitals that were treating the Inuit population in northern Canada, and they could find 0 cases of breast cancer. None. Like breast cancer in America affects 1 in 9 women. And now, 50 years later, almost 50 years later, breast cancer is almost as high in the Inuit population as it is in any other ethnic group. Japanese women have very low levels of breast cancer. In Japan, in the United States, when they emigrate, within 2 generations, their breast cancer rates are just as high as anyone else. So it's clear, and you know, people have said this in the research literature, like the leading epidemiologists have said, you know, that some large percentage of cancer is preventable. Like as large as 70 or 80%, the rest is just bad luck. But of that 70-80%, and some large percentage of that is diet. It's not chemicals in our drinking water, it's not industrial pollutants, it's diet. And you know, the argument, it's pretty clear looking at a historical perspective, which these researchers don't do, that refined carbs and sugars should be the prime suspect. So you get them out of the diet, and then basically you're just going back to eat the foods we evolved to eat. And this is what the paleo diet movement's all about. So, you know, you just don't eat the refined carbs, you don't eat the sugars, you don't eat the easily digestible carbs because they were not around when we were evolving. You know, you could also, if you want, there are other foods, the paleo movement, the vegetable oils, which I'm not so sure about one way or the other. You don't eat the foods we evolved to eat. Another way, one of my favorite sayings in this business is from Eric Westman, who's a physician who's been treating, using the Atkins diet to treat obese and diabetic patients at Duke University Clinic for 10 years now. And Eric says, eat what you are. It's not you are what you eat. You know, in which case you eat fat, you become fat. It's because you eat carbs, you become fat. It's eat what you are, and what you are protein and fat. So that is almost by definition a healthy diet. The problem is your doctor isn't going to believe it. Like time and time again, I get emails from people all the time now. You know, I tried the Atkins diet 10 years ago, I lost 60 pounds, and then my doctor talked me out of it.
Yeah, very common.
Very common. So, you know, and the whole Atkins thing, Atkins was vilified and demonized so much by the medical research community. I also have doctors say, I read your book, I agree with everything you say, but of course I'd never prescribe the Atkins diet. Well, the Atkins diet is just a diet that gets rid of the fat and carbohydrates and doesn't restrict calories. So that means you get rid of the carbs and you eat a lot of fat and protein, mostly fat because we can only metabolize so much protein. And now you're eating a high-fat diet. I did do, you know, I talk about this in Good Calories, Bad Calories more than Why We Get Fat, but the whole history of how we came to believe saturated fat is a problem. It's terrible science.
It's very terrible science, yeah.
So, you know, I mean, it's a shame that we got to convince the medical community because these diets work wonders for weight loss. They improve heart disease risk factors, but if you go on it and your doctor thinks you're killing yourself, it's going to be harder. And we could use our doctor's help and our doctor's knowledge. So one of the things I say in the book is, you know, read this book. If you find the argument compelling, give it to your doctor.
Yeah, pass it off to the doc. Yeah.
Pass it off to your doctor. And if you happen to know your congressman, pass it off to him or her too.
And the bottom line here is to eat real foods. Eat the foods that we evolved to consume. I can never understand the logic behind how an old food can cause a brand new disease. It really boggles my mind how that. Last question for you. What'd you eat today?
what I ate today, well, I skipped lunch because we've been doing this interview, but I'm probably going to eat as soon as it's done. What I have for breakfast every morning, eggs, bacon, sausage. You know, I always say that, like, again, one of the knee-jerk responses from the medical community is that diet works if it's boring, you lose weight, even though people evolved eating boring diets. You know, the idea that we all ate, you know, we had 57 different ways of making pasta for dinner, and if we don't have the pasta, it's boring, is something I never bought, but I have pretty much the same thing for breakfast every morning. I'm a big fan. If I go to a restaurant, I have eggs, bacon, sausage.
Makes you smile.
Makes me smile.
Gary Taubes. Very good stuff. Thanks for all you do. Guys, check out the book, Why We Get Fat. Phenomenal book right here. Check out the entire interview at undergroundwellness.com. We are out of here. We're about to go work it out.